computer. There we go. Okay. Well, welcome to the second and final plenary session for the 12th International Conference on Emotions and Work Life. All of the conference sessions have been successfully completed now. 27 papers have been presented in 8 sessions. We've also conducted a successful, small but quite high quality doctoral consortium, and we've conducted the first of the plenary sessions, which was a few hours ago. This is the second of the plenary sessions where we'll be looking at sessions 5 through 8. And as we did yesterday, each of the session chairs will give a brief rundown of the papers that were presented in their sessions and make a comment on the overall pictures that emerged from those papers. Following that, we'll open it up to general discussion, and then we'll roll over to looking at some ideas for future research. So the Emonet conferences have typically ended up with an incubator session. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to incubate some ideas. These sessions are being recorded, and together with our wonderful organizer, Audrey Tare, I'll get these uploaded, and you can view them at your leisure, or others can view them at their leisure. And we'll move on. Just a reminder again that the 13th Emonet conference will be hosted at Lancaster University with Ron Humphrey as our local coordinator. That will be on the 29th and 30th of June. Hopefully this awful COVID business will be resolved by then, and we will be able to meet in person. We'll be issuing the call for papers for that conference very shortly. Just a heads up that at yesterday's plenary that some of you attended, we did discuss the idea that while Emonet conferences are typically not themed, I like to say that they're self-themed, where the theme emerges from what topics are hot coming out of the papers in the session. It does seem to make sense for having some sort of theme for the 2021 Emonet 13 around the crisis that we're going through at the moment. So we'll probably think of something along that line. Again, people will be able to submit papers on any topic, but we'll see if we can set up some theme sessions dealing with international crises like the COVID-19 pandemic that we're enduring at the moment. Okay, without further ado, I will hand over to Session 5 Chair, Professor Ashley Cross, who will tell us about the papers in that session. Thank you, Ashley.
Sure, thanks, Neil. So I was fortunate enough to have the not so pleasant emotions session, and which included the best paper too for the conference. They're a great bunch. They're really a good quality bunch of papers. Just a quick reflection, I was a bit concerned going in about how much engagement there would be virtually, and if people would have done their homework and listened to the presentations. And look, I was blown away on both accounts. There was a lot of chat and really insightful comments and discussion in that session. It was people had clearly done their homework and were quite engaged, and we went up quite a bit over time. So I thought that was a good indicator that people were really involved and engaged in the session. So there were 2 empirical papers and 2 conceptual papers. And I think as an overview of those papers, what I really liked where they were meaningful papers that had the potential to make an impact. So talking about what we're thinking about for the future next year maybe as a theme, all of these papers had an impact to understand or change people's lives. So I thought that was a really nice way that they hung together. The other thing about all of these papers, and which I found about this conference, and is they sort of blow my mind. They're quite creative. They bring together different theories and constructs that I would never have thought of bringing together in a way to understand a phenomena that's been around often for a long time, but I would just never have thought of bringing those theories together and those concepts together. I'm using clearly emotions as the sort of the lens, I guess, to understand that. So the first paper was by Zhuting Zhang, apologies for my pronunciation, Zhuling Fan and Wei He from Nanjing University, and they looked at the social consequences of anger expression. So they were looking at anger expression and how that impacts on people's perceptions, or that person's leader emergence of leadership. But they were looking at it through the mechanisms of the perceived competence of that person who expresses anger. You know, how does that impact on perceptions of their competence and their warmth, and what that does to their leadership emergence. So there was a really nice program of 3 studies that were put together, starting off with 2 experimental studies and then going into a critical incident-based survey. The other nice thing about this paper, and I think I would really like them to expand on this a lot more, is they were interested in, after anger expression, the place of anger apology. So what happens if you express anger and the perceptions on that, but then what happens if you then apologize for that anger expression? And I thought that was really a cool idea, and I think that's probably they hadn't explored that enough in this paper, but I thought that was a really nice idea going forward. And they'd started picking up on Geddes and Callister's dual threshold model of anger, which I love, that model. If you're not familiar with it, I'd look it up. So that was a lovely paper. Then the second paper was from Zhizhen Cheng and Wei Chen, Wendy, and Chao Lu. And they were looking at revenge, so another negative type of idea, revenge behaviours towards supervisors, negative gossip. So they were looking at what happens when supervisors spread gossip, and what's the response of that, I guess, on what do the subordinates then do in I guess response to that? Do they go on and then gossip about the supervisor? Does that then give them permission to go on and create gossip? Or does it give them permission to, or does it create them gossiping, just, I guess, gossiping more among members? So they were looking at the implications of gossip through perceived ethical leadership. So that was another really nice study. And what I really liked about this study, which I would never have thought about, is they brought in TMX and LMX. So they looked at from a social learning theory perspective and a social exchange theory perspective. And they looked at how the quality of the leader-member relationship and the TMX relationship, how that impacts then on whether you take gossip further and forward. So that was a nice one. The third paper was the best paper, and I'd really recommend you listen to all of these papers in details, but I thought this one has a lot of potential for future research going forward. So it looked at the emotions of failure in organisation life by Roy Smolin and Smita Singh from Auckland University, I believe. And so really what they did is unpack the literature so far on the emotions of failure in an organisational context. But they looked at sort of a big picture idea, looking at the negative emotions associated with failing. They looked at failing, the process of failing, but also failure. So they looked at failing and failure, but they looked at the negative outcomes and the positive outcomes of that, and the negative and positive emotions associated with that. And it really resonated in this COVID type of environment too. Roy used a lot of examples in COVID, but also as an academic, our experience, we often fail.
I think we're familiar.
yeah. So anyway, it's a great paper, and looking at the positives and negatives of failing and what determines if you can move through that failure or not. So yeah. So I'm going on. And then the final paper was in the doctoral consortium from Martha, who's also one of Neil's students. This is a great one, I think, with a lot of potential. The impact of social rejection. So what that does to individuals' values over time, how being exposed to social rejection, it changes your values system. So I thought a very impactful and powerful type of topic that's got a lot of potential. And Master's looking at that through the lens of emotional distress, but also emotional numbness. Emotional numbness is something I haven't thought about too much, but it makes sense, I think, in terms of this whole idea of being rejected socially, and then how that impacts on your values. So I'll stop there, but just to say that they're a great bunch of papers.
Thank you very much for that, Ashley. So the next session was one that I chaired. This was session number 6, and it related to emotions and performance. So in all of these studies, the dependent variable is performance. So I'm going to let you have a look at the abstracts of the papers. So I'm going to share my screen to screen number 3 here. There it is there. Okay. Share. Okay. So you can all should all be able to see the abstract of the first paper there, right?
Yes.
Yep, thank you. Okay. So this is the paper that won the Best Student Award. So this was by Mana El-Mansouri and Caroline Strauss from ESSEC. Mana is here today, so I hope I get this summary right, Mana, or I'll be in trouble. This is what I really like about this study. In fact, there's several things to really like about this study. First of all, the results are not what you expect. A lot of young researchers in particular have great hypotheses and have lots of tests of things that are, well, we probably know it already, so there's just not much of a contribution. That's not what this happened in this study. This is a study looking really at the dark side of proactive behaviour, particularly proactive behaviour related to change events. So how do people react to change events? So that when you see a change, if you react in an angry way to it, rather than being proactive, you're probably likely to do battle against it and engage in counterproductive workplace behaviours. On the other hand, if you see a change event that evokes a feeling of concern or anxiety, in that case, and it's quite a surprising result. Usually you see anxiety as sort of bad stuff, but not in this case. We have the anxiety leading to proactive behaviour, and they find some neat results supporting both of those scenarios, the anger leading to counterproductive behaviours and the anxiety leading to proactive behaviours. What's really nice about this study, it was an experience sampling event, but looking at events. And my experience is that these studies are really hard to do. But they found 124 proactive events across 82 respondents. And they got some really neat results. So most deserved winner of our Best Student Paper Award. The second paper in this session was by one of my students, Agata Bielakovsky, who's only in the early stages of her doctoral studies. She's working with me and Michael Collins. Michael is an ex-military and has set up with his former colleagues at the Australian Defence Force Academy to test her studies. So it's nice when you're a student to have your participants in your studies all organised before you're even starting. So she's going to conduct a series of studies involving in our ultimate study actually involving an intervention. So it's all about the role of identity leadership. So the idea is that that identity leadership, in other words, reinforcing this idea that that people are members of a group with a particular goal to do as a team, looking at a positive emotional climate as a mediator. And in this study, she's looking at emotional intelligence as a moderator at two stages in the model. It's a bit unusual that she's looking at the emotional intelligence of the followers at one part of the model, and the emotional intelligence of the leaders as actually setting up this positive climate that's going to lead to the higher levels of performance. And as I said, her final study actually includes an intervention, so she'll be able to do a causal study here. And we're just at the moment laying the groundwork to test that study. So do have a look at that model in detail. It's quite quite an incisive study. The final paper in the session was presented by Momin Haq Talukta. Momin is at Victoria University in Canada, but he actually collected his data when he was living in Sydney. He didn't quite get to the bottom of why he was in Sydney collecting his data, but that's where he collected. But it's an amazing data set involving, I think I counted 10 variables that he's collected in field settings, and he's looking at what the supervisor family support does it encourage high levels of performance. And the remarkable thing about his study is the huge database that he's collected from real settings. I think he needs to be clearer about how he collected the data, because even after his session, I didn't quite really get the extent to which the ultimate performance data was objective performance or self-report performance. I think it was objective. If it's objective performance, it was quite a complicated. I've never seen the family support model tested in such a comprehensive way with a model that looks at all of the possible mediating processes in that connection, with how supervisor family support ultimately translates across to performance. He found positive results across all of his variables except for one of them, which was, I can't quite remember which one it was. Positive related job satisfaction, life satisfaction, and job performance. There was one that wasn't significant. Can't remember what it was anyway, but it was an interesting one. Look, it's a great study. Please do spend some time looking at this study. So those were the three papers in my session. I'll quit the balance when I find the right screen that I'm supposed to be looking at to do that, and then we'll move on to the next paper. Oh, there it is. There. Stop share. Okay, so we'll turn over to the next chair, who was Anne. Anne, I have to unmute you first. There we go, Anne.
You just muted me again. That's all right. So I had a very interesting session, and we were all talking about organisational change and the impact of emotions in that. And I have a good list of key themes that came out from all of them, because they were all about disruptive change, sort of within an organisation that had failed, another one which was an individual organisation. The other paper was about sector change, and my paper was about both types, actually, a whole sector change and an individual organisation. And there's some really interesting methods used, which I'll talk about in a minute. But a lot of it was about the importance of context. So we could see that coming through. And the other key theme was actually around mixed emotions. Certainly in two of them that really came out. and issues of identity. So I'm very excited to hear that Emonet started from Ron's paper with Ashforth, because that was a key point in my original doctorate. So discovery identity, so that came through. So the first paper was Lena's one, which was about ambivalent feelings in organisational change. And she had, her context was about a housing association, and she'd managed to get herself inside it. So having explained, you know, the whole issue of housing associations in the UK, how it was a move from public sector to sort of part privatisation, which of course creates a profound change for people, for an organisation you've gone into as public service ethic perhaps coming through, and then suddenly you are actually part of something which is looking at costs and managerialism, which was interesting, having been through that myself in an organisation that had changed. So having explained all that and looking at the literature, one of Lena's arguments was about actually that emotions are often just seen as types of emotions, and you're only one thing happening at a time. And what was coming through here, as has come through in the rest of the conference, I think, about being able to see the positive and the negative at the same time, so which she saw as ambivalence, and this was the thing that had got missed. And explaining that, of course, that originally it's usually talked about in an attitudinal way, which is around cognitive behaviour rather than emotional. So she was bringing that in. And she found some useful gaps in her literature, which enabled her to really start thinking about what she was going to do. So her methods were fascinating. All three were actually constructivist type or qualitative research, so very different from many of the other papers. But we're talking about change, so how else do you capture it? And she was using a mixture of observation and interviews, but she'd actually been a participant observer and had been in the organisation, and at one point taking on roles such as the receptionist and working in the call centre, so that she had really got a feel for the organisation, and that people had accepted her very happily and worked with her. So she got a lot of other observations. So that was really, so it was a really interesting paper and really worth seeing the presentation. It's clearly explained, and it really was approaching, I mean, it was a new area, because new public management in those sorts of areas are something that's a fairly recent phenomena, and actually understanding how people felt about that change of value set. And then we move from there neatly into Sandra's paper, which was how do organisations emotion related, I'm going to have to read it properly rather than just looking at my notes. Sorry, I can't read my writing at this time of night. So it was about how the involvement of emotion-related practices in a self-liquidating organisation in a context of radical change. So again, going into radical change. But the self-liquidating organisation was fascinating, because this was all about an organisation very well respected with a long history, which had suddenly, in the space of a fortnight, had to self-liquidate itself. So, and it was triggered by a major external change, so she had been able to track this over 2 years, and at the moment is doing her doctorate and is coding as we speak. I think she said she'd be doing this evening, so she wouldn't be joining us, but it's been hard work.
Good,
so she's
good excuse, I guess.
She's got lots of ideas, and so she again had managed to get herself into the organisation. So she'd managed to come in sort of as a researcher, but had ended up doing things. So doing almost a consultancy role within there, training them about emotions and how they need to work. And she was astounded by the fact that nobody had thought about the emotional task of actually liquidating this organisation. Nobody had really ever had to think about emotions, I think, in the organisation. It's one that had a very strong identity. And so it was really important that it was able to wind itself down well. And she had she's some interesting methodology in her interview. So as well as observation, again, real-time observation, she was there as it was all happening. She had done timelines with them. And so it was the structure for her interview in a way. She got them to draw how their emotions felt in any way they wanted. And then that allowed her to interview them. And she came up with a interesting framework for actually looking at these, that she'd been able to work from this. There was the fighting for survival, then there was the transition period, and now there is the self-liquidating period. And then under individual and collective, she looked at how people were feeling about it, about suppressing their emotions, mental distancing, and in the collective part, being kind, structuring it, and a lot about the identity. And when she talks about the emotion-related practices, the ones she's coming up with is thinking about, how do you make an ending? How do you have that wake? How do you go through that bereavement process of the organisation? So that's another really good presentation, which I recommend you actually look at. And so we had some interesting conversations about areas such as, these drawings, did they actually look like the Kubler-Ross curve? And no, they were all completely different, and people did things very differently. So those were two papers. Oh yes, there was a third paper. Yes. And I remember what I talked about, because I wasn't the one listening. So, I mean, my paper was actually very linked into these, because I was actually working in 3 different organisations. The other 2 were case studies. And what I set out to find out about was the role of workplace relationships in creating that sort of supportive context in which engagement could particularly emotional engagement, could take place during disruptive change. And I'd chosen the period just before Brexit, during that last run-up, when was it going to happen, wasn't it, were we going to have a no deal, can we legislate to make sure we don't, and of course we're still going to have it. And it was a period just after, when we just changed Prime Minister, just before our current clown actually got elected. And then, so for one lot, it was just at that time of the leadership election, and the other lot was just when we were going through all the stuff with Parliament coming up to the end of October, and that, 1 million people on the streets in peaceful protest against it. So, and these were government departments actually looking and actually involved in this. And I've been able to use another innovative piece of, an interesting methodology, in that I'd had an app adapted for me by some, now I call them colleagues, from 2 surgeons, one surgeon, one consultant in emergency medicine in our local hospital, who developed this app for emotion, getting how people are feeling emotionally, and looking at that from engagement perspective, and giving organisation feedback in rapid time. And they adapted it for me. How lucky was I? That's fantastic. And so I'd been able to get people to tell me about how they were feeling after an interaction they'd had with somebody else at work, either a colleague, a co-worker, or a close colleague. So that's what I'd been looking at. And whereas I've been talking about it for ages, as many of you here know, but I'd actually got some data. I've followed it up with interviews, and this was actually around understanding three key things were around the little things that make a difference in relationship, the how that relationship work has to sort of take place before people got on with their real work and the task work. And then the other one was I developed a model which explained to me how the relationships change from co-worker to colleague, and finally close colleague to friend. So that was mine.
Thank you very much for that, Anne. That's truly a fascinating session. I'm sort of amazed how well the papers have coalesced together in the sessions. We had an intensive organising committee meeting where we themed the papers. So it's worked. It's done quite a
That
good
was
job.
brilliant. They really did all work,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I have to say,
But every session's been like that, including the next one. So, Chow, you want to tell us a little bit about the 4 papers in the last session?
Yeah, my pleasure to do that. First of all, I just would like to take this opportunity to thank all the organizers for this conference for giving me this great opportunity to serve as a session chair. And I also appreciate all the participants, and particularly those who are with us today here. As a junior scholar, I actually found that this Emonet conference is very fascinating and fantastic because, I actually learned a lot from the constructive comments and feedback from some of the participants in my session. It's also great that, because my session on emotion in sustainability and entrepreneurship is a multidisciplinary session. So we have scholars and researchers with different areas of expertise and from different backgrounds, including family business, international business, organizational behavior, entrepreneurship, and strategy. And because of the overlap and the synergies among the research interest from different scholars, we trigger lots of interesting research questions, and we also explore lots of interesting and exciting future research directions as well. For instance, I remember, one researcher from my session has done something related to biodiversity, and the other researcher actually has done something related to sustainability. Then all of a sudden, they have a lot of things in common, and that actually sparked a lot of great discussion going back and forth among different researchers. So in my session, there are 4 excellent papers written by different scholars. So the first paper is entitled as "It Takes More Than Two to Tango: Everyday Passionate Consumer Entrepreneurship," written by Cruz and Holiday. So this study actually is a quite important study which answers the call to bring consumer knowledge as a resource into the understanding of the entrepreneurship. It significantly contribute to the entrepreneurship literature by rethinking and reconceptualizing entrepreneurship away from the current conceptualization of entrepreneurship as a solitary heroic endeavor by adding something that are more social, relational, interwoven perspective into that line of literature. So the passion driving the venture is actually shared by a group of fellow enthusiasts and a network of sources and resources such that it takes more than 2 to tango. So in that paper, 2 researchers develop a model which involves physical, cultural, and emotional resources, and how these different resources interplay with other important variables to impact important outcomes. And we also received pretty good and excellent comments from some of the participants in that session. For example, I recall one of the participants mentioned the issue and interesting perspective regarding how work-family conflict and work-family enrichment influence, the entrepreneurship or the venture startup by the married couples. And probably, when a couple experience some positive emotions at home, that may actually spills over to what they will actually do to initiate a new venture, which I think is an interesting and very valuable comment to push that line of research forward. So the second research paper actually is entitled as "A Bibliometric Review of Socio-Emotional Wealth and Family Business Literature." This is also a pretty critical and great study, given the fact that family firms represent 2/3 of all the businesses across the world. So it's actually quite important to investigate, what has been done in the family business literature and what should be done in the future line of research in the area of family business. So the overlapping nature of family and business aspects constitute a very unique characteristic that explains the idiosyncrasy of family firms. So the researcher done by Gagallo Castel, she used the Web of Science to collect all the data regarding all the published articles in the topic of family business and socio-emotional wealth literature. And they discovered that the significant contributions of family business and the socio-emotional topic in terms of the impact, journals, authors, universities, and countries. And they also found that the family business and socio-emotional wealth literature actually represent a very important field of inquiry in the field of a business. So the contributions of that paper are to identify the most significant literatures, highly cited articles, highly cited scholars, so on and so forth, in family business and socio-emotional wealth through a very rigorous and thorough bibliometric analysis of current literature. Again, they summarize what has been done in the past and also pave the way for the future research. And I remember that there was also a very great comment regarding, how they going to use multiple databases in order to improve the rigor of that study. One of the participants suggests that they may use Google Scholars or some other databases to see if the same results would be replicated. And the other researcher also mentioned that probably she can also consider different search keywords and different synonyms to see if the same results will actually hold or not. So that's the contributions of the second article. The third article, written by Lusso and Victoria, which is entitled as Exploring the Emotional Experiences and the Coping Strategies of Sustainability Change Agents. Sustainability change agents are subject to stressors that are considerably unique to their profession. Not only do they have to deal with a substantial amount of workload and stakeholder empathy, but also they have to personally navigate the stress-inducing existential threat of the climate change. So in that paper, their objectives were to investigate the experiences of sustainability change agents and how they are motivated to create change and how they manage their emotions to respond to the climate change. I really like that study because that study used very rigorous methodology. They used the mixed method approach to test their research questions. First and foremost, they did very in-depth interviews with sustainability change agents to identify how they're going to use different coping mechanisms to deal with stress. And I believe that according to their study, these change agents use 3 different coping mechanisms to deal with their experiences, including emotion-focused coping. They turn this as rational avoiders, problem-focused coping. They turn this as committed goal setters, and meaning-focused coping, and they call them as green philosophers. And these findings actually are also supported by a very interesting physiological study. They measured the heart rate and galvanic skin responses of these participants, and they confirmed that the Sustainability Change Agency is indeed an emotionally laden profession. I think that study can have quite significant implications for the field of healthcare and medical profession as well. I recall that there was one researcher who had an excellent comment regarding how that researcher can actually weave the emotional labor literature into this line of research, and how they gonna, these sustainability change agents manage their emotion to deal with their stresses and to deal with their feelings. For example, they may use and perform genuine emotional labor to manage the stresses they have experienced, which I think is very important directions for them to follow. Last, certainly, but not least, the last article presented by Ness, which is entitled as 2 Minutes to Midnight, Unpacking Organizational Responses to the Existential Risk of Biodiversity Loss. And they also address a very important topic regarding biodiversity loss. While biodiversity loss has been extensively examined in the scientific literature, the management community, unfortunately, pays very little and very limited attention to it as a critical business issue separate from the broader challenge of the climate change. So that paper reflects on the role of urgency, fear, and disbelief in tackling biodiversity loss. And they perform a qualitative meta-synthesis, and they unpack the differences in the cognitive and emotional frames concerning the issue and consequent variations in approach to conservation practices and business initiatives to prevent biodiversity loss. So these are the 4 great papers in my session on the topic of emotion in entrepreneurship and sustainability.
Thanks very much for that, Chow. What excellent sessions we finished off the conference on. I thought those last 4 sessions were really quite outstanding. So let's just engage in a little bit of discussion. Any reactions, overall comments on what's arisen from these sessions, and then we'll roll that over to see if we can come up with some ideas for future research. It was great, especially in Chow's session, that you actually built that into your session, so that was good. So who wants to get the ball rolling in that regard?
I mean, I've just always been impressed by how many of the sessions ran over time. I know, like Ashley's did, Chow's session. People talked for another 20 minutes or so past the hour. So I mean, people have been very enthusiastic by these articles, and I think the ability to read the articles in advance or read the presentations and listen to them in advance really helps people perhaps prepare for the discussion. But regardless, we've had some excellent presentations and just very enthusiastic participation from people in the audience. So they're just fantastic.
One of the comments that Peter Jordan made earlier on was this conference was just like the real thing, except there's no grog.
Well, I have mine.
That's a good way to finish off the session. And of course, Emonet conferences would traditionally finish with a great dinner after the last paper presentation.
Yeah.
We'll all be missing this year. So some other reactions, comments, observations, and perhaps where our future research might go.
I was just to finish up on that quick comment about the lack of grog and things, was maybe if we're ever in this situation again, and hopefully not, but it might be quite nice to put in some networking time, sort of a virtual coffee break or whatever at particular times, because you can always in Zoom, you can always have breakout groups and make people go and chat to each other. Just
that's a good idea. Virtual coffee/wine, depending on which zone you're in. Yeah.
Yeah, we did actually reflect that we possibly could do that. We thought, well, we didn't really know how many people would be turning up. There's over 180 people who registered for this conference. Would you believe? We've almost consistently, session by session, had basically the number that we've got here at the moment. So there's 17 people in attendance here. So virtually every session has been, that's right, isn't it, Audrey, between about 16 to 19?
Yes, that's about it. Yeah, we have 191 signups.
Wow.
Yeah.
191.
So we didn't really know how many people would be there, so that's why we're a little bit nervous about setting up any sessions with breakout rooms like that. But now we've got a bit more experience. If we do this again, and I'm not sure where in the future we're going to go with these. This has been a you couldn't imagine a bigger disruption than this little number, could you? The whole world turned on its head, and suddenly here we are communicating with this amazing technology. I read one article a couple of months ago saying, what if the COVID had occurred in 2005, 15 years ago? How would we have coped? The technology the fantastic technology that we've got today. I think we had Skype in 2005. Did we have Skype then? And Skype was working reasonably well, but it just didn't have this sort of flexibility that we're seeing at the moment. But of course, there is a professional version of Skype now that does offer the same service as Zoom. And of course, a lot of institutions, I think Griffith University, you were saying, Ashley, has standardized on Microsoft Meetings, which is exactly the same as
Teams.
this.
We all have to use Teams with our teaching.
I'm sorry, not
everything.
Meetings, it's Teams. It's Teams, isn't it? Yeah,
Teams,
so we're using Zoom because Zoom's had a few problems with security along the way, what's called Zoom bombing. So we haven't Zoom bombed at this conference, but the introduction of
the tight security
and higher security. All of these sessions have been run using the Zoom facilities at the University of Queensland. That basically enables us to have unlimited access, etc., because we've got the full package. So that's why I've been starting off each one of the sessions and then handing over the hosting of the sessions to the chair. So there are some possibilities there, but also some amazing research opportunities that are going to come up in the future. So when we put together that sort of sub-theme for next year's conference, Ron, Ashley, Audrey, and me will be meeting on Monday to review this year's conference and to get geared up for next year. But that's something that we'll be considering.
One thing I was curious about, and can we get any data on how many downloads there have been? So I know this is a really committed group that I'm seeing familiar faces at every session, which is awesome. But do we know how many people, because there's 180 or 90 signed up, how they're accessing it? Are they just, how many people are downloading the slides? Are we able to know that, Audrey?
I don't think so. We can't find that metrics for our site. But I'm thinking that people are just coming to see the presentations. I do have quite a number of friends who sign up just to see the presentations, but couldn't make it for our sessions.
Yeah, and that's fair enough.
I have noticed in the various sessions that there've been quite a few extra names that people have just spotted a particular paper that they're interested in and came along to the session to see the presentation. But that's been good as well, because the whole conference has been offered to you for no charge. We actually have a little bit of money in the Emonet kitty from past conferences. It's sort of been accumulating year after year, so we actually have a little bit of money that we'll be able to use also to get going in next year's conference. But of course, if it's a live conference, we will be having to have a fee, and as well as that, we've actually already signed a contract and paid a hefty deposit to Lancaster House for next year's conference. So we certainly hope it'll go ahead in that respect. So still looking for incubator ideas. Any of the other members of the audience who've anything across the conference that's sparked their imagination?
Well, I mean, certainly people were talking about the global crises like the coronavirus pandemic, but of course we are also hearing about the sustainability issues as sort of a global crisis, and of course we've had financial crisis. I mean, certainly emotions during these crisis situations is certainly something that's quite interesting.
I think that's a really good point, and something that hasn't cropped up very much in the emotions literature. Thanks for mentioning that, Ron. I did have a student a few years ago, a guy by the name of Peter Nudig, who who worked in that area of emotions and finance. Peter actually, we engaged in some discussions with Dan Kahneman, who quite a few of Peter's ideas and put them in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, without acknowledgement. But that's another story.
Right, yeah.
But Peter did some great work. Unfortunately, as soon as he graduated, he became very much in demand as a consultant. And you know what happens to doctoral students who graduate and then have a great career as a consultant. But he found some excellent results relating to investment strategies and emotions. Especially, he found that young investors, novice investors, more precisely, novice investors who do all their homework and go to large extents to try to go through all of the mathematics and predict the stock movements consistently lose money. The experienced investors know that the only accurate prediction that you can make about the future is you haven't a clue. So the more experienced projectors don't try to predict the future, but are much more adaptable, and they make money. So that was a great result that he found, but unfortunately it was never published. But I think there are excellent opportunities in that area of financial investment, the relation between emotions and intuition. Emotions and creativity is another area. Emotions and proactivity is an area that's really rich. Ron and I participated in a symposium in Hong Kong last year. Luckily, we got in just before all of the disruptive things that have happened.
Right. Yeah.
I often reflect walking down the very street just down the road from the hotel where Ron and I were staying. It was such a bustling business place, and reflecting what happened last year with all the riots in that very street in the Causeway area. It was just appalling what was going on there. But we were there before that, at Shu Yan University up on top of the hill there, and Kelly Ping was the organizer, and a book based on the proceedings of that conference will be coming out next year. It'll be out next year. So that should be really exciting. So I think this whole idea of proactivity, creativity, one of my students, March Toe, who's now at the University of Western Australia, has been working in that area with Jing Zhu at Rice University over in the USA. So there's lots of opportunities to work in that area as well.
Yeah, an excellent paper in our program on proactivity and emotion. So yeah,
absolutely, with Mana. I'm really impressed with that one.
Definitely. I was impressed with the range of methodology that was used. There seems to be a swing back towards, well, at least in Emonet, more qualitative.
It has been a feature this year, hasn't it? Very much so.
Which I found really, I really appreciated that, I guess. It gives a more nuanced, rich sort of take sometimes on a particular phenomena.
I was just thinking one of the things that you said, Ashley, as you were introducing your session about what happened in your session about they were all meaningful papers and they all had an impact. Now, and with research relevance being much higher in the agenda, I mean, if we think about the conference next year and focusing it a bit around emotions in these major disruptions, it gives us an opportunity to do something which is meaningful for the future. This is how we coped, and what are the lessons from that which we can take forward to whatever next major disaster or disruption is. Might be something.
Yeah, certainly a lot of current interest in that. One thing that a lot of my master's students have been writing on, and they're fascinated by the reaction from the coronavirus crisis, but what they're focusing on is how people are now conducting work through things like Zoom, and this huge switch from, in the UK, 12% of the people working sort of online or from home or some sort of distance work arrangement to 40%, during the height of the lockdown. And, and of course, that has tremendous impact on all the emotional processes and interpersonal processes that's occurring at work, with potential loneliness, miscommunications, lack of emotional stimuli, but also positive opportunities as well, and using the technology now where you actually can see people and see their facial expressions has sort of revolutionized distance communication over the days when it used to be a written letter or then the email that was considered fast, the email. And now we actually see people, we hear their vocal tone, we see their emotional expressions. So it sort of has been a game changer. But the number of people who are probably working sort of online has never been higher, and whether it will go back to the way it was, a lot of observers think that it won't. Once 40% of the people have been found they could do their work from home online, they're not going to go back to the office full time anymore. And so certainly that's a huge change that just happened. It's part of a longer trend. Certainly there's already a lot of literature on people working via the internet. But that certainly, I know there's a lot of public interest in that, and
I get the impression that that something that might be shaping up for next year's conference is going to be something along the lines of emotions in times of disruptive change.
Yeah, that could be great.
I think that's probably the way we'll head.
I think adding to what Ron said just now, people, I'm doing data collection through interviews. I find that people are more willing to do interviews through Skype or Zoom nowadays as compared to before the crisis. And I think it has to do with the loneliness that people feel as compared to when we have to do experimental studies and surveys. We have to be, well, lots of people wouldn't actually click on the link to a survey, but they will accept the invitation to do an interview during this time. Yeah, that's what I think. In terms of methodology, we can do a lot about that. We can possibly even have a session on research on emotions, looking at methodologies.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Audrey. And that came up in Anne's session last night a little bit. In some ways, not so much about getting but the participants were much more willing to talk.
Yeah.
And it was almost a cathartic thing for them. It was almost a therapeutic thing for them to be able to talk about their experiences and their emotions. Yeah. So the act of actually doing that research and being a participant has an impact. We're talking about our research having impact, but the participation in the research is also impactful.
Yeah, and that's it becomes an intervention in itself without you realizing.
Yeah. Really... I can see Lena's on here. I don't want to, but Lena she mentioned she was the one that did the interesting thing work on public housing. But she was mentioning, I don't know, Lena, if you want to put your camera on, but she was looking at being a lonely female living by yourself in the COVID situation. Is that correct, Anne? And I thought that was fascinating.
Lena's there, and I've just unmuted her. So, Lena, do you want to comment?
Oh, okay.
Lena doesn't want to comment, so that's all
right. Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, all right. Well, listen, we're just about out of time. It's 3 minutes past the hour now. We started a little bit late, but I know that for you people in Europe, it's getting late, and I've got to think about getting on my bike and heading off to the office. So I think we're coming to the end of this year's Emonet conference. It's been absolutely thrilling to put on this session, going right back to when we came to the realization back in February. It was around about then, I think, that we were not going to be able to meet together physically as planned. The reviewers have done a brilliant job, and of course Audrey has made it all happen. Thank you so much, Audrey. Yes, we all owe Audrey a hand. And the reviewers, all the reviewers were in a day after the deadline for reviews. What? No,
Yes,
go
that was
kill me.
amazing.
I've never heard of that happening before. And by and large, the reviewers have been conscientious and constructive. I've heard nothing but good comments from the authors, including the authors of the papers that didn't make it into the program. That they really appreciated the feedback that they had. We have a group of around about 15 papers, I think, Audrey, that have agreed to go forward for consideration for the next volume of research on emotion in organizations. It's about 15 papers. Of course,
about 17 or 18.
Okay, 17 or 18. So we'll be meeting shortly to work out a subset of them. About 10 of them will end up going forward in the book. As well as that, we'll have some invited contributions for, and that will be volume 17 of Research on Emotion in Organizations. Now, volume 16, which is the second book from the 2016 conference, which was the last conference chaired by Shaman Hartel, Wolf Zerbe, and me. It's now in the late stages of proofing. The final proofs have been out to the authors. Final corrections are coming back as we speak. So it'll be published in September this year. So please look out for volume 16 of Research on Emotion Organizations. It's published by the Emerald Group. If your library doesn't subscribe to the management series in the Emerald collection, perhaps speak to your librarian about that. And of course, all of the books in the series are available online. The book series is also indexed in the Social Sciences Citation Index. It's always a little bit late in appearing there, so I think they're up to date to volume 15 now. So you can actually access the book via that resource if your library has access to it directly. If you come across a great chapter that you really need, just send me an email, and I can grab it off our system and send it out to you. It's legitimate to do that if it's for research purposes. So I can do that as well. But obviously, we want to support our publisher, the Emerald Group, that have been doing such a good job in getting these books out and providing us with excellent support. I should add that there were three volumes actually prior to the initiation of the Research and Emotion Organizations. That were published by who were they published by? The first one was by now owned by the Greenwood Group. The second one was published by I've forgotten the name of the publisher. That guy who was originally married to the president. We've got Roy speaking. Can you hear Roy's voice at the moment coming in the background? No, it's just in my headphones. My computer's been playing Roy doing his introduction quite anyway, so I have to speak over Roy's talking. Take the headphones off. No, I need to leave this on. But the book series will continue into the future. It'll be volume 17. We'll only do one volume from this conference, and then from next year's conference we'll do volume 18, and then off into the future. I don't know whether anybody's noticed, but I'm getting older. As time goes on. I'll be I celebrated my 75th birthday just a few weeks ago. I'm now on a fractional appointment, a 50% appointment. The good news is I no longer have to teach, but I will be retiring from my now half-time employment at the end of 2022.
Wow.
So we need to think a bit about the future. Of course, we've got a new team now with Ashley and Ron joining me, so we're good for the next few years. Shaman and Wolf Zerbe, of course, have been the chairs right from the beginning of Emonet, going back to 1997, and have now moved on. Shaman chaired one of our sessions. Shaman's now at Monash University. Wolf Zerbe is running a private university based in Vancouver at the moment, so he's sort of become tied up with administrative matters, but of course he's still a great supporter. So the future of the Emonet group will go on. If anybody hasn't signed up to the Emonet listserv, please do so. You just got to Google Connect at AOM. That'll take you to the Academy of Management site. Once you get there, click on communities, all communities, go down, scroll down, not too far, to the emotions in organizational life, and join. You don't have to be a member of the Academy of Management to join the listserv, by the way. So that's the way to keep in touch with news as it comes out. It's quite a lively group. Sort of went through a bit of a dip when they changed to the new system that they have at the moment, but it's building back up again now. So it's pretty lively and pretty active. So keep in touch that way. And yeah, I look forward to seeing all you guys and lots of other people and all of the people interested in the Emonet group in Lancaster in just under a year's time. Mauna has said, thank you all for the very constructive feedback and input. My first Emonet 2, and I hope it won't be the last. Very much looking forward to next year. Thank you for the organisation committee for their efforts and for the very benevolent atmosphere. It's been brilliant, guys. And let's see if we can keep the momentum going. So that's it. As the two Ronnies used to say, it's good night from me and good night from him. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating. It's been just such a thrill. Thanks, Ron and Ashley, for being such wonderful co-chairs, and super thanks to Audrey for being our coordinator. So I look forward to seeing you in the future. So I'm going to finish